This one gets me going, so we're gonna try to have some fun with this. We're on women. We have all been fighting it apparently for quite some time on the right, and the GOP's war on women. We have with us today Hadley Heath from the Independent Women's Forum, and we have Colleen Holcomb from the Eagle Forum. And we have Stacy Mott, we all know her, president of Smart Girl Politics. So we are going to get started. They're going to introduce themselves first, and then we'll move on from there. Go right ahead, Colleen.
Hi, thank you so much for attending this panel, and thank you, Smart Girl, for having this summit. My name is Hadley Heath. I work at the Independent Women's Forum in Washington, D.C. It's a public policy organization for women. We argue from a free market perspective that free enterprise, limited government, personal responsibility serve women better than big government. And we emphasize that, like Smart Girl would also emphasize, that the women's groups on the left don't speak for all women. So we want to be present in that conversation. Particularly, we focus on economic policy issues, and I'm really looking forward to this panel. You can find out more about us at iwf.org. We produce a monthly policy focus I think all of you would be interested in, and you can join up for the newsletter there. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here with you. My name is Colleen Holcomb. I, for a few more hours, am the executive director of Eagle Forum's Washington, D.C. office. Eagle Forum is a pro-family grassroots conservative organization that was founded by Phyllis Schlafly in 1972 in the wake of the fight against the Equal Rights Amendment. And Phyllis got her start as an anti-communist crusader, but she's had a unique gift for perceiving legislation that really sounds good, but does a lot of damage to the American society, and particularly to the constituencies that it claims to serve. In this case, it was women. But we have a national grassroots organization. We have state chapters throughout the 50 states. Our DC office is the liaison from Washington, DC to our state leaders, and we do lobbying on Capitol Hill, and we have a political action committee. I am going to be leaving. I'm hoping to learn from you, to join your ranks, because especially during this last election, I thought I would have been much more effective staying home in Virginia and trying to get out the vote in my neighborhood rather than doing work from Washington, D.C. and in the various races we tried to impact. But I'm just so appreciative of what you all do, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you.
And as you all know, I'm Stacy Mott, president and founder of Smart Girl Politics, and I'll let Tami go ahead and start. I'm a shy girl.
All right. Hadley's going to start out with giving us just an overview of the 2012 election and the war on women as it relates.
Right, look out, there's still bombshells going on outside. This war on women made it a really dangerous place for all of us. I know we're happy that's over. It's never going to be over. That's the case, right? With some of the women's groups on the left, and really any organization on the left, the good exercise is asking them, when will your fight be over? When will you be satisfied? When will your organization no longer be necessary in this world? And I think after 2012, there was a lot of hand-wringing and agonizing within the conservative ranks. What did we do wrong? Was it that comment? Was it this comment? Or do we have some systemic disease that turns women voters away from us? And while some of that is healthy, because I do think there's things that we can do, some introspection is good. You know, if we had a President Romney in the White House, would we be having the same conversation? I think it's important sometimes when we're in the wilderness, when we feel like the out party, to do some realigning of the ranks and figure out where we can improve. But we also need an accurate picture of the problems. So while 55% of women voted for Barack Obama and 55% of men voted for Romney, the gender gap is not the only gap. It's not the only problem. In fact, the gender gap is actually several problems that have come together. For one thing, turnout. Turnout is higher among female voters than it is among male voters. 53% of the population that votes are female. Another important differentiation we can make, even among women and men, is that young voters tend to be much more democratic. we look at the voting bloc that is young voters, and we see that in 2008, under 30 voters made up 18% of the voting population. In 2012, that was 22%. So under 30 voters are so heavily in favor of this president that in spite of the fact that over 30 voters would have elected Romney, under 30 voters changed the outcome of this election. Now, on a side note, young voters are not the most reliable voters. They don't show up in midterm elections as much as they do in national elections. Midterm elections, the last one we had in 2010, under 30 voters made up 11% of the voting public, so a much lower percentage. And also within the gender gap is a gap that relates strongly to marriage. We know that married voters are more conservative. Unmarried voters, whether they're men or women, tend to be more democratic. So while everyone knows that 73% of single women voted for the president, do you also know that about 70% of unmarried men voted for this president? So when I tried to look back at some of these numbers and what happened and what's going on with maybe why we have some of these differences, I think it's important to take a look at maybe a few different variables. And the 2 or 3 variables I'm going to stress in just a few minutes are sex differences between men and women that may drive some of our different views and values and valuation of different issues, and also messaging. So I don't think it's really within any of our control, the natural differences between men and women. We could even have an interesting discussion about how many of those differences are natural and how many are learned. But women and men have different life experiences, and probably the biggest gap in the 2012 election, the most startling polling number, was that people who ranked compassion as their #1 value in a president, 81% of them voted for Barack Obama. 18% voted for Romney. So Romney was not perceived as a compassionate candidate, but I think largely the conservative idea is not viewed as a compassionate worldview or one that makes room for so-called people like me when people come to answer that polling question. And there's a lot more data about the way that men and women behave differently when it comes to politics. I'll save some of that for later in the panel. So maybe we're looking at a playing field that isn't exactly fair. Maybe women, because of risk aversion, because of a general lower tolerance for using force and some of the factors that influence women's views in the world, maybe there's only so much we can do to change that. But I think the Republican establishment, and in some ways the conservative movement, makes the problem worse by using poor messaging tactics and by being very far behind in the way that we talk to women. I don't need to say anything about rape. We can all just have a collective eye roll about certain things that certain candidates said. That can't be undone, but there are other ways that we can improve our messaging to women, and I've got some solutions to our messaging issues that I'd like to talk about later as well. But really, just to get us started, I wanted to bring up sort of the different factors that drive the gender gap in politics and paint a broader picture of what's going on with women, men, the youth vote, the married vote, and voter turnout as well.
Great, thank you, Hadley. Colleen, talk to us about the success of women like Sandra Fluck and Emily's List, groups like Emily's List and the War on Women. Why do you think they're successful?
Honestly, I think the reason they're successful is because conservatives have backed into a corner and have done a terrible job providing any kind of inspiration and providing, I think, the kinds of role models, the kinds of rhetoric that I think we can only expect to come from all of you. They've failed to make the case, and it's an accurate case, that conservatism really is, it's not only the political value, but the free market, freedom, constitutional freedom, limited government. That is the most empowering, the most liberating type of government philosophy that individuals can live under. So I don't like to give credit to the Sandra Flucks of the world because I think it's just embarrassing. But I think, and it's unfortunate that it's not just the conservative men, although they have backed into a corner. But if we were having this discussion probably even last year before the election and before some of the votes, I would tell you really great success stories from 2010. I'm sure all of you worked hard, and we all worked to elect some really strong, solid conservative women who were running against Obamacare, who were running against the abuses of this administration, who were embracing constitutional government and economic freedom. And what happened was they got to Washington, D.C., and they backed away from those principles, and they simply failed to inspire. And they got caught up in the Washington rhetoric of, don't be controversial, don't say anything that could possibly get us in trouble with the feminists. We failed to take them on. So they've gotten away here. We are championing a woman who is a celebrity on the basis of a high birth control bill that she wants the government and all of us to pay for. Where have we gone in this nation? And how are we failing our daughters? How are we failing ourselves by failing to tell our stories and failing to celebrate the real heroes in this room and throughout the country? So I would say that the successes that they've had are really more a reflection of our failures.
Okay, so throw it back to Hadley then, because you were just talking about messaging. How do we message
I'm so
in a
excited you
way?
have solutions, Sadie. So
I have suggestions. I don't think that there is a silver.
anger. You
I don't think there's a silver bullet, right? We all have to be hopeful about the direction of our country, because that's why we're here. But of course, Sandra Fluck, she's not a role model for me. I don't champion her, but what she did for the left was she put a face and a name on a cause, and she became a victim that they could tell a story about. And that is one way that they just beat us to death on the messaging. I mean, is there a woman or man in that fight who's sort of the anti-Sandra Fluck? Is there someone, there are hundreds, if not thousands. There's over 200 plaintiffs right now challenging this mandate to provide comprehensive coverage for various types of contraception in the court system right now. We know Hobby Lobby is one of those plaintiffs, right? But we don't really have stories out there. We also don't have quite the megaphone that the left has to tell these stories. But the more of them there are, and explaining that, if a mom and pop shop ends up being very successful and hires that 51st worker, but they don't believe in offering the week after pill and their health insurance coverage to their workers, that means they have to shut down. They have to shut their doors. There goes 51 jobs, but those are 51 people with names and stories. And that's where we are. That's one area where I think we're very far behind, and that's one thing that Sandra Fluck, like her or not, she is a story, she is a person with a real name.
Stacy, why don't you talk to us about just the war on women as a whole and what SGP has done to kind of counter that?
Everybody knows her name. She's infamous. The war on women is infamous. One of the things that I think happened in 2012 is, and to your point, we got backed into a corner and we took the eye off the ball. Because that's great that all these women that she fought for to get birth control, but how many of you have been to your doctor for your annual exam this year? Okay, well, let me surprise you. Because, and it's personal experience, and I'll put it out there for the whole web. They're now, you're now required, they'll ask you, obviously, you can refuse, but you're required to get the HPV testing when you have your pap smear, your annual pap smear. And if you test negative, you cannot go back for 5 years. 5 years. How many women are going to die in those 5 years if they get cervical cancer? And each, don't get me wrong, each insurance plan is going to be different and each state is different. But I'm telling you personal experience. And if you do test, you can go every 2 years. So how many women are we going to lose for some of these new Obamacare rules? We can all laugh, and the left can laugh about Sarah Palin saying death panels, but there's people out there from Democrats now admitting that she was right. So we took the eye off the ball and we let ourselves get backed into a corner discussing contraception. And I'm not saying it's not a fight worth fighting, But let's turn this back around onto them and all the things that we're losing because of their, silly fights on this war on women, this faux war on women. Let's talk about all the women business owners who are closing their doors. Let's talk about the women who, are not going to get their mammograms as often as they were going to, or these testing. Let's talk about the women, you want to talk single women. How many of these single women are being negatively impacted and losing their jobs because, of the economy? Let's talk about the real issues. Let's talk about the economy. And I don't think, that we did that to the best of our ability in 2012. And I definitely don't think, speaking to Republicans out there, that they did a good job of putting that message on how their actual policies would benefit every range of women, single women, married women. Let's talk about it, how their policies would help promote and impact, small business owners, women business owners. Do any of you remember hearing any of those policies about how they were going to help small, women business owners? You don't hear that. They're too busy defending themselves, and so are we. And to your point, going back to that, we backed ourselves into a hole. Now, there were some of us, all of us, who tried to fight back. In fact, Michelle, we put out a video last year when Sandra Fluke, or Fluck, whatever her name is, came out and started all of this. We tried to step up to the plate and get the message, the counter message out. And I'm going to ask Michelle to play our video right now of what SGP put out last year to counter that. One of the things that the left does, you don't hear somebody from the left come out and say, I'm a liberal woman. They assume, and rightly so, that they speak for all women. And a lot of times we identify ourselves, rightly so, as conservative women. And I think it negates sometimes, that we need to come out and assume that we speak for all women, just to the point that they do. We need to put out there the impact that, the left and some of these trivial war on women, as they claim, things are impacting all women, and there is a negative impact. And I think, organizations like Eagle Forum and IWF, and there's a litany, there's some great women's organizations out there, obviously, SGP, that are trying to fight back. And, as we kind of finish our discussion, there's other things that we can do, and I think all of us have a few ideas of ways that we can go about that.
If I can say something else about that, speaking for all women, first of all, I love the ad, and I saw it when you guys originally produced it. Absolutely. My first reaction to the ad is, how little does the United States look from an international perspective when we're having this faux fight about whether or not everybody's health insurance should include coverage for a long list of drugs, and that somehow equates to a war on women. From an international perspective, there are places where women are not treated like citizens, not guaranteed human rights, not guaranteed the basic liberty to live, to own property, or to vote. So when I think about that and I watch this ad, I just think, wow, contraceptive coverage, that's what it's come to. It's really mind-blowing. But in terms of speaking for all women, the left has to try to do that. They have to try to speak for all women because they have to provide some kind of one-size-fits-all solution to every problem because they want to solve problems through government policies. We don't have to agree on nearly as much stuff because when you believe in limited government, I'll let you speak for yourself, I'll speak for myself. I'll live my life according to my values, and you can have some different values, but we don't have to agree on what's in our insurance policy. We don't have to agree on what's taught in our schools. We don't have to agree on a whole long list of things that we can differ about because we're not having a one-size-fits-all solution or a debate about what that should be.
Thank you. I completely agree. And there are so many good points. I want to underscore all of them. But just the point that you made, and this is a continuation of the discussion that we had earlier, for liberals, government government really is their God. So for them, you're right, it's easy to have a one-size-fits-all approach, and you pass legislation, you're in favor of women, you support birth control, you can be an environmental warrior by supporting some bogus legislation that probably won't do any good. And we know it doesn't do good, it just creates more problems, and thereby creates more demand for government and more demand for these phony cost concepts. Now, conservatives, we know we have actual solutions, but we know that they're not in the government, and that's part of the problem, because we have other places to go for our fulfillment. We can go to our families, to our communities, to our churches. We're not running to the government all the time, so political activism is not always going to be the first place we go. We tend to go when the government overreach gets so bad that it's interfering with our enjoyment of our lives. So our involvement tends to be cyclical, and I think that goes back to when the conservatives failed to inspire and failed to do what they promised to do. So many conservatives just stayed home and focused on what they thought mattered and what they could areas where they could actually find some success and where they could actually solve some problems. So that is both a strength and a disadvantage of conservatism. But just going back to Stacy's point about well, I think both of you made the point about telling the story, but about the rationing, the real rationing that is happening. I was in DC, I remember begging some of the leaders in the Republican Party, please, 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 this is your opportunity to reach out to women. We're fighting Obamacare. Let's do ads saying, let's compare the breast cancer survival rates in the UK versus what we have now in the United States. What is this really going to do to women? And they didn't want to hear about it. They wanted to do things the same way, and it truly is harming women. Like you said, Hadley, instead of talking about differentiating various types of rape, why couldn't we have been talking about these real abuses that are happening under Obamacare? The unfortunate reality is we can't count on leaders, political or otherwise, to do it, but we can do it ourselves, and that's incredibly powerful through your blogging, I love your social media presence. That is tremendously effective, and I think it does come down to telling the personal stories, because that really does transcend politics, and I think that's the only way we're going to change minds and cross barriers.
You know, the governor earlier encouraged us to commit to asking ourselves what we can do moving forward. And I think it's important that we realize that, you know, being at a conference like this with other people that agree and, you know, maybe disagree with us, but building relationships and getting to know people and know that you're not alone in your fight. And I think that's all part of what you're talking about. To finish the discussion, and then we'll throw it to questions, talk to us about, beyond what you've already said, what you think we can do moving forward, if you want to start.
Okay. I won't monopolize, but I think all of you have a tremendous opportunity. I really think the grassroots are the answer. As I said, talking, using your social media connections, blogging. So many of my Facebook entries try to focus on what a real war on women is, whether it's the Senate refusing to honor Margaret Thatcher or these rationing issues, but focusing on the real wars that we are facing. I loved the ad. The real war is at the gas pump. It's in the unemployment lines, where the policies of this administration have put many of us, or our children, or our husbands, who we're allowed to care about. But all of you can really make a difference. And I know it's frustrating when the leaders don't do it, but you can do it so much better anyway. So I encourage you to do the messaging. Not only that, but I would just like to encourage all of you, at Eagle Forum, we work both with grassroots activists and we do lobbying on the Hill, and I cannot convey to you how effective grassroots lobbying as constituents to your members of Congress and to your senators how important it really is. They do listen to you. They won't listen all the time. I liken it to children. They're not going to listen all the time, but you have to discipline them. You have to tell them the truth. And they'll surprise you and sometimes impress you during the times they will listen. And the more we can keep our legislators on track, the more we can have something to inspire voters, and the more ground we'll gain. So I encourage you, please make sure you're contacting your members of Congress. Let them know who you are. Let them know how many people you reach. Let them know you're a member of Smart Girl Politics, and then what church you go to, what organizations you attend, how many people you have what they need. You have voting members of their delegates, so you're their constituents, and they know you vote, and that you'll take others to the polls, vote in primaries, do all the necessary things that we need to do to keep them in line. So I'll stop there.
I mentioned earlier I had some suggestions when it comes to messaging, and I imagine that many of the people at the grassroots level already know this stuff, and you guys are masters of this, but if I had some suggestions for maybe members of Congress who are conservative, or talking heads, or if you're a blogger, if you have some kind of voice, and all of you have a voice, especially when you're talking to people that you already have relationships with, whether it's your friends or family. I know it's a difficult conversation to have about anything political, but it's very important. And I would say one of the reasons that the Life of Julia ad was so effective was not necessarily that women reading this ad said, yeah, I want to be like her and I want to be dependent on the government at every stage of life, but it was a personal story and it was positive. It was about a woman living a good life in the United States. Whether or not you and I see that life as the good life, the targeted audience for that ad thought it was a good life. And conservatives naturally are in a position of saying no most of the time because we are the backstop against the growth of government. But being the party of no or the movement of no is not very attractive, especially not to women voters, and especially not to young women voters who have most of life ahead of us. So I would suggest embracing a more positive tone because really, women in this country have so much to celebrate. Men do too. But we're at a stage where we're being tempted into a victimhood mentality by the left, and women are not victims, not as a class. There are individual women who I'm sure have been victimized by men, by corporations, by any kind of bully that you want to name. But as a class, women are not victims. And women are not really a voting bloc. And I think celebrating the diversity among women in the United States should be our game. We should say, yes, there are all different kinds of women in this country, and they have all different kinds of life circumstances, they have all different kinds of dreams, they have all different kinds of desires. And emphasizing and celebrating that diversity is something that is a very compatible concept to the concept of limited government. I would also say for our messengers, we have a tendency on both the left and right to use absolute statements, to say, well, we're good, they're bad, this policy's great, this policy's terrible, life is like this, life is not like that. But it's also, I think, more effective with especially female audiences to qualify our statements and to recognize that life is complex. It's a lot of complicated relationships that we go through in life. It's a lot of complicated choices we have to make that come down to trade-offs. But we are very much in control of our own lives, and the choices that we make, we should feel empowered that we can make those choices in a world where government's not interfering too much. Now, another thing that we as the right are doing in a way that's sort of systematically behind the times is messaging research. On the left, they pour millions and millions of dollars into very advanced messaging experiments, and they find out which words work better with which audiences, and the digital social media presence. I love Smart Girl. There are groups on the left that outfund our conservative women's organizations 10 to 1. That really is the ratio, 10 to 1. Women's organizations on the left fundraise us $10 to 1. And so they pour this money into a social media presence or to messaging research. We can do messaging research too. And what we have found at IWF is that sometimes we make presumptions about the way that women think or the way that Americans think that isn't necessarily what they think. For example, conservatives have a tendency when we talk about the wage gap to come in swinging saying something like, there's no such thing as workplace discrimination. Nobody's getting discriminated against because they're a woman. This is 2013. And God bless, it is 2013, and I was born in the 80s, and I've never faced sexual discrimination in my workplace. I work at a women's organization, for crying out loud. But some women have, and that reality impacts such a large part of the population. 74% of women believe that workplace discrimination is a serious issue in the United States. So if we come in with our guns blazing like, this is not a problem, and 74% of people listening don't agree with our premise, they're probably not going to hear us out on our solution, right? So messaging research is another one. And finally, I would just say vocabulary. vocabulary. There are some things some word choices, obviously, that conservative candidates have used, and I'll use a different example that has nothing to do with rape. In the second debate, Mitt Romney did say something about binders full of women. Let's leave that one alone too. The worst thing he said to me that night was talking about workplace flexibility, which again, should be one of our issues, and can be a place where conservatives can lead with one of those positive messages. But he said a woman in his office needed this kind of flexibility so she could get home by 6 to do what? To have dinner on the table, right? And I work from home most of the time. We have a very flexible workplace arrangement at Independent Women's Forum. Sometimes I like to do yoga during my lunch break, you know, and those are the things that I'm doing as a young single woman. I'm not getting dinner on the table by 6, you know, for myself, much less a family. So there are ways that we can talk to this segment of the population where we're really hurting, which is young single women. We don't have to assume that everybody has a family. How many times have I heard a Republican candidate say, you know, your family's budget looks like this, and if the national debt was like your family's budget, I don't think of my budget like my family's budget. I think about it like Hadley's budget, you know? And so there are simple ways that we can change the way that we talk to people and qualify our message that I think could really resonate with an audience that maybe has a tendency to turn their ears off when we start talking about things that they assume don't relate to them.
Well, I think to Hadley's point, you know, there's so much money on the left invested in their women. I mean, Democrats reach out to their women. They make them a priority. They really do. And I don't, do any of you feel that from the Republican Party? That you're made a priority in your thought processes? I mean, there are things that we can impact, and that's obviously not one of them. We can push our legislators as much as we want. But, you know, the messaging on the left is phenomenal. I mean, let's give kudos where kudos belong. When Sandra came out, boy, they lined up behind her. I mean, and another area we can't impact is necessarily the news media. They lined up in her court too. But, you know, there are areas we can fight back. We can fight back online. We can fight back. We have phenomenal bloggers. Look at the bloggers back there. I mean, we have 25, 30 bloggers, female bloggers. SUP has a network of 15, 20, you know, volunteer bloggers. You know, we have networks out there that we do not, and I'll own up to it as well, we don't utilize our own resources the way we could. And, you know, our 3 organizations have partnered in the past, and I think it's definitely something that we need to look at going forward. I mean, Eagle Forum on the legislative, you know, arm is phenomenal. I mean, they are on top of legislation like no other organization. Independent Women's Forum, you know, their white papers, their policy experts. I'm not going to pretend I'm a policy expert. I look at these ladies on a daily basis and what they're putting out there. And I think, you know, the one thing that SUP does, we have women on the ground in all 50 states. We have, you know, we need to, and we are working together more, is to take that legislative piece and let our activists know, you know, what's going on in the legislatures in the states, and really put out our voice when there's an issue, and everybody stand behind each other. I know we each have our own projects. We're women, we're conservative women, we have busy lives. You know, we don't all focus on the same thing. But, you know, when there's an important issue that we need to fight back on, we need to stand strong behind each other and behind these organizations. And, you know, when there's something that Independent Women's Forum is putting out that they believe in, you know, the SGP says, hey guys, take a look. This is important legislation. This is important, you know, policy. This is the way we can take back the, you know, the conversation. And you have stats and figures to back you up. So, you know, I think that we need to use our networks a lot better than we have in the past. Like I said, everywhere. Sandra was everywhere. I mean, those women, you could, I mean, and to your point, they're well funded. They're extremely well funded, 10-to-1 advantage over conservative women's organizations. You know, we have to work at strengthening our organizations on our side as well, and we're working hard to do that, and I think we'll make it a bigger impact in 2014, 2016.
All right, I know there are probably a lot of questions, so we are going to throw it to the crowd.